Hello and welcome to News 24. I'm sitting with Graham Tucker, who is a portfolio manager at Old Mutual Investment Group MacroSolutions. Graham, every year Old Mutual Investment Group produces a document called Long-Term Perspectives. What is the objective of that document and why do you think it's necessary to have a long-term perspective?
We often say that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And people, in our view, don't have a long enough sense of history. They don't go back, they think about the last few years and use that as their guide going forward. Our view is you need to take a longer term look at things, at asset classes, at the behavior of markets, in order to get a better idea of what could happen going forward.
Would you be able to give us an example of that?
Let's look at property. So local property for the last 15, 20 years has been the best performing asset class in the South African market. And people remember that. They remember that period. But if you go back into the 80s, property actually went backwards in real terms. You lost money. You had experienced a lot of volatility. And so without that perspective, you might get caught into the trap of just believing that property is a one-way bet. So that's why we like to go back and look at history. I can give you another example. Take 2008. The market's coming off quite sharply, but what you saw historically is that when the market's gone through these very bad periods, you've seen a recovery post that. And that's exactly what we saw after 2008. Some very good returns coming out of the equity market. Without that perspective, it's very difficult to make or to arrive at that conclusion.
What would you say the three key takeaways are for investors in this document?
The first is around inflation. Inflation erodes your spending power. 10,000 Rand today at 6% inflation becomes 1,700 Rand in 30 years' time. Your spending power decreases sharply. The second is around risk assets or growth assets. And this is around equity and property. That's what we typically define as growth assets. These are the only assets that deliver those inflation-beating returns historically. They don't do it all the time, they don't get it right every single year, but over the long term, that is what you need to grow your wealth ahead of inflation. And the third is around diversification. Investments is seldom a smooth ride. So you need to have a diversified portfolio of investments, equities, property, bonds, local assets, offshore assets, in order to ride out the stormy patches. And so diversification, I would say, is the third key message.
South Africa's sovereign credit rating was recently downgraded to junk status. Is there anything in long-term perspectives that can help us navigate this?
The third takeaway I mentioned, diversification. Diversification is incredibly important. You have exposure to bonds, property, equity, local assets and offshore assets. By mixing that together, you're able to ride out these turbulent times. The second point is around active management. There's no doubt that we're going through a more volatile period, and that is probably going to stay with us for some time, which is why active management is so important, because that volatility, even though it gives people unease, it creates opportunity for investment professionals to shift assets, to try and earn some extra return in that environment. And you've seen a few examples of this recently. Look at Brexit. Look at Donald Trump winning the US election. The reaction in the market was quite violent and rebounded quite quickly. So it's that kind of opportunity that you can take advantage of in these volatile periods. Diversification, active management.
Graham, thanks very much for joining us at News 24.
Thanks, Alex.